United Nations Headquarters, New York City, September 1959. The air conditioning hums softly. In a third-floor conference room overlooking the East River, 3 Soviet diplomats sit around a mahogany table during a mid-afternoon break from General Assembly proceedings. The youngest among them, Yuri Dubenin, 28 years old and recently assigned to the Soviet UN mission, watches as an American aide wheels in a cart bearing refreshments. Among the offerings are several glass bottles, their distinctive curved shapes immediately recognizable, filled with a dark, carbonated liquid that catches the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Coca-Cola. The senior diplomat, Viktor Sukhodrev, a veteran of Stalin-era negotiations, lets out a derisive laugh. He turns to his colleagues and speaks in Russian, assuming the American aide cannot understand. Look at this. The Americans offer us their capitalist poison. This drink, it is nothing but sugar water and chemicals, a symbol of everything that is wrong with their society. Cheap pleasure, empty calories, manufactured desire. His companions nod in agreement, their smiles carrying the certainty of ideological superiority. But curiosity, that most human of impulses, proves stronger than conviction. One by one, they reach for the bottles. The Cold War in 1959 existed in a peculiar state of tension and tentative engagement. The death of Stalin 6 years earlier had ushered in a period of relative thaw under Nikita Khrushchev, who had denounced his predecessor's cult of personality and initiated policies of peaceful coexistence with the West. Yet the fundamental ideological competition remained fierce. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a global struggle for influence, each claiming to offer humanity the superior path to prosperity, justice, and progress. This competition played out not merely in military build-ups and proxy conflicts, but in every arena of human endeavor: science, culture, athletics, and perhaps most visibly, in the realm of consumer goods and everyday life. The United Nations, established in the aftermath of World War II, served as one of the few venues where Soviet and American officials regularly encountered one another in a diplomatic context. These encounters were carefully choreographed performances, each side presenting its positions with rehearsed precision, but they also created opportunities for informal exchanges that sometimes revealed more than formal negotiations ever could. In the corridors and conference rooms of the UN building, Soviet diplomats experienced their first sustained exposure to American society, and what they found there challenged many of their preconceptions. Soviet officials arriving in New York in the late 1950s came prepared for what they expected to find. Their briefing materials, prepared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and informed by Marxist-Leninist analysis, painted a picture of America as a society in decline. They were taught that capitalism, by its very nature, concentrated wealth in the hands of a small ruling class while impoverishing the masses. They expected to see widespread unemployment, homelessness, and social decay. They anticipated that American workers would be exploited and alienated, trapped in a system that valued profit over human dignity. American consumer culture, they were told, was a facade, a thin veneer of prosperity that concealed the rot beneath. Coca-Cola occupied a special place in Soviet propaganda about American capitalism. The beverage had become, by the 1950s, one of the most recognizable symbols of American culture worldwide. Soviet ideologists pointed to Coca-Cola as evidence of capitalism's essential frivolity and wastefulness. Here was a product, they argued, that served no real human need, that provided no genuine nutrition, that existed purely to generate profits for its manufacturers while encouraging unhealthy consumption habits among the masses. The Coca-Cola Company's aggressive global marketing was characterized as cultural imperialism, an attempt to colonize the world's taste buds and minds. Soviet cartoons and posters frequently depicted Coca-Cola bottles as symbols of American decadence and exploitation. Yet for all this ideological conditioning, Soviet diplomats arriving in New York could not help but notice certain discrepancies between what they had been taught and what they observed. The city itself was overwhelming in its scale and energy. The streets were filled with automobiles, not just a few cars for the elite, but thousands upon thousands of vehicles, suggesting a level of widespread prosperity that seemed inconsistent with the narrative of capitalist immiseration. The shops displayed goods in quantities and varieties that were simply unavailable in Soviet cities. People on the streets appeared well-fed, well-dressed, and moved with a casual confidence that suggested they were not living under the constant anxiety of deprivation. Yuri Dubinin, the young diplomat watching his colleagues reach for those Coca-Cola bottles, had grown up in Moscow during the hardest years of post-war reconstruction. His childhood memories were of rationing, of standing in long queues for basic necessities, of his mother carefully dividing scarce resources among family members. He had joined the diplomatic service as a true believer, convinced that the Soviet system, despite its current difficulties, represented humanity's future. He had studied English and American history, always through the interpretive lens of Marxist analysis. He knew that Coca-Cola had been invented in 1886 by a pharmacist in Atlanta, Georgia, that it had become a global brand through aggressive capitalist marketing, that it represented everything the Soviet system opposed. He knew all of this intellectually, but he had never actually tasted it. Viktor Sukhodrev, the senior diplomat, was the first to open his bottle. The distinctive hiss of carbonation escaping made a small sound in the quiet conference room. He raised the bottle to his lips with an expression that mixed skepticism and curiosity, took a small sip, and paused. His face registered surprise. He took another, longer drink. The other diplomats watched him, waiting for his reaction. Finally, he spoke. "It is not what I expected." There was something in his voice, not quite admission, not quite defeat, but a small crack in the edifice of certainty. The taste of Coca-Cola is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. It is sweet, certainly, but not simply sweet. There is a complexity to the flavor, a combination of vanilla, cinnamon, citrus oils, and other elements that the company has always kept secret. The carbonation provides a sharp, almost aggressive effervescence that awakens the palate. The sensation is immediately pleasurable in a way that seems almost engineered, which of course it is. The Coca-Cola Company had spent decades perfecting this formula, conducting extensive market research, adjusting the balance of ingredients to maximize consumer appeal. The result was a beverage that delivered an instant hit of pleasure, a small moment of sensory satisfaction that cost only a few cents. Yuri Dubinin reached for his own bottle. The glass was cold and slightly wet with condensation. He twisted off the cap and brought the bottle to his lips. The first sip was a revelation. The sweetness was intense but not cloying, the carbonation sharp and refreshing. He felt the cold liquid travel down his throat, and in that moment something shifted in his understanding. This was not poison. This was not empty calories designed to exploit the masses. This was simply a well-crafted product that delivered exactly what it promised, a moment of refreshment and pleasure. The realization was small but significant. Perhaps not everything he had been taught about American capitalism was entirely accurate. The historical record shows that Soviet officials' encounters with American consumer goods often produced this kind of cognitive dissonance. Nikita Khrushchev's famous visit to America in September 1959, the same month as this scene, included a tour of a supermarket in San Francisco, where the Soviet premier was visibly impressed by the abundance and variety of products available to ordinary Americans. His initial reaction was to suspect that it was all staged for his benefit, that the stores were specially stocked to create a false impression. But as his visit continued and he saw similar abundance everywhere he went, he was forced to confront the possibility that American prosperity was real and widespread. The Coca-Cola bottle became, for Yuri Dubinin, a symbol that would recur throughout his diplomatic career. Over the following months and years, as he attended receptions, negotiated treaties, and navigated the complex world of international diplomacy, he found himself repeatedly encountering that distinctive curved bottle. Each time, it reminded him of that first moment of discovery, that small crack in his ideological certainty. He began to notice other things, too. The efficiency with which American businesses operated, the innovation evident in American products, the genuine prosperity that seemed to extend well beyond the ruling class that Marxist theory insisted must monopolize all wealth. This is not to say that Dubinin abandoned his socialist convictions or became an apologist for capitalism. He remained a Soviet diplomat, loyal to his country and its system. But his understanding became more nuanced. He began to recognize that the world was more complex than ideological categories suggested, that both systems had strengths and weaknesses, that the competition between them was not a simple morality play, but a genuine contest between different approaches to organizing human society. The broader significance of these small moments of cultural encounter cannot be overstated. The Cold War was, at its heart, a competition between two visions of human possibility. The Soviet system promised equality, security, and collective purpose. The American system promised freedom, opportunity, and individual prosperity. For decades, these competing visions were articulated through propaganda, diplomatic speeches, and military posturing. But the real test came in the lived experience of ordinary people, and increasingly, as travel and communication expanded, in the direct comparisons that individuals could make between the two systems. Soviet diplomats were in a unique position to make these comparisons. Unlike ordinary Soviet citizens, who were largely isolated from Western influence, diplomats had regular exposure to American life. They shopped in American stores, ate in American restaurants, observed American neighborhoods, and interacted with American colleagues. They could see with their own eyes whether American workers were as exploited as Soviet propaganda claimed, whether American society was as decadent and unstable as they had been taught to believe, whether American consumer goods were as shoddy and meaningless as ideology insisted. What many of them discovered was deeply troubling to their worldview. American workers, while certainly not living in a socialist paradise, generally enjoyed a standard of living that exceeded that of their Soviet counterparts. They had access to a variety of consumer goods that was simply unavailable in the Soviet Union. They lived in larger apartments, drove their own cars, and could choose from dozens of options when shopping for basic necessities. The gap was not subtle or debatable, it was obvious and undeniable. The Coca-Cola bottle, in this context, became more than just a beverage. It represented the entire edifice of American consumer capitalism, its ability to create products that people genuinely wanted, to distribute them efficiently across a vast nation and beyond, to deliver consistent quality at an affordable price. The fact that Coca-Cola was available everywhere in America, that any person could walk into any store and purchase it for pocket change, that its quality was identical whether purchased in New York or Los Angeles, spoke to a level of economic organization and efficiency that the Soviet planned economy struggled to match. Viktor Sukhotrev, the senior diplomat who had initially mocked the Coca-Cola, found himself ordering it regularly at UN receptions over the following months. He never spoke about this to his colleagues, never acknowledged the small hypocrisy of his actions. But Yuri Dubinin noticed, and he understood what it meant. The older man had spent decades defending Soviet ideology, had survived Stalin's purges, had dedicated his life to the communist cause. Yet here he was, quietly enjoying a product of American capitalism, unable to entirely deny the pleasure it provided. The personal transformation that occurred in Yuri Dubinin over his years in New York was gradual and subtle. He did not defect, did not become disillusioned with his country, did not reject socialism. But he developed what might be called intellectual humility, a recognition that his understanding of America and capitalism had been incomplete and in some ways inaccurate. He began to read American newspapers and magazines more carefully, trying to understand the society on its own terms rather than purely through Marxist analysis. He developed friendships with American diplomats and found that they were not the imperialist warmongers of Soviet propaganda, but thoughtful, complex individuals who genuinely believed in their system's virtues. One particular incident stands out in his later memoirs. In 1961, during a tense period following the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was invited to dinner at the home of an American diplomat named Robert Harrison. The evening was awkward at first, the political tensions making casual conversation difficult. But as the meal progressed and wine was consumed, the conversation became more honest and searching. Harrison asked Dubinin directly, "Do you really believe that America is on the verge of collapse? That our system is unsustainable?" Dubinin paused before answering, aware that his response might be reported back to Soviet intelligence. Finally, he said, "I believe that both our systems face challenges. I believe that history will judge which approach better serves human needs, but I no longer believe that the outcome is predetermined or obvious." This admission, carefully worded as it was, represented a significant evolution in his thinking. The young ideologue who had arrived in New York in 1959, certain of capitalism's inevitable failure, had been replaced by a more mature diplomat who recognized complexity and uncertainty. The Coca-Cola bottle had been the beginning of this transformation, a small crack that gradually widened into a more fundamental questioning. The impact of these personal transformations on Cold War diplomacy was significant, if difficult to measure precisely. Diplomats like Dubinin, who had direct experience of American society, tended to be more pragmatic and less ideological in their approach to negotiations. They understood that Americans were not cartoon villains, but real people with legitimate interests and concerns. This understanding made it possible to find areas of compromise and cooperation, even amid the broader ideological conflict. The arms control agreements of the 1960s and 1970s, the cultural exchanges, the gradual thawing of relations, all of these were facilitated by diplomats on both sides who had learned to see beyond propaganda and ideology to the human reality underneath. The Coca-Cola Company itself was aware of its symbolic significance in the Cold War. The company had long pursued an aggressive strategy of global expansion, viewing international markets as essential to its growth. But in the Soviet bloc, Coca-Cola was officially banned, viewed as a symbol of capitalist penetration. The company made several attempts to enter the Soviet market during the 1960s and 1970s, but these efforts were consistently rebuffed by Soviet authorities who feared the cultural influence that such an iconic American product might exert. Yet even in the Soviet Union, Coca-Cola acquired a kind of mythical status. Soviet citizens who traveled abroad often brought back bottles as souvenirs, sharing them with family and friends. On the black market, Coca-Cola commanded premium prices, not because of any inherent superiority over Soviet soft drinks, but because it represented access to the forbidden West, a taste of the world beyond the Iron Curtain. The bottle itself became a collector's item, displayed in apartments as a conversation piece and a subtle form of protest against the restrictions of Soviet life. By the 1980s, as Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms began to open Soviet society to Western influence, Coca-Cola finally gained official entry to the Soviet market. The first shipments arrived in 1985, and Soviet citizens lined up to purchase the legendary American beverage. Many were disappointed. After decades of build-up, the actual taste could hardly live up to the mythology. But the symbolic significance remained. Coca-Cola's availability in Soviet stores represented the broader opening that was transforming Soviet society. The acknowledgement that Western consumer goods were not poison, but simply products that people might reasonably want to consume. Yuri Dubinin rose through the ranks of Soviet diplomacy, eventually serving as ambassador to the United States in the late 1980s. By then, he was a senior statesman, respected for his knowledge of American society and his pragmatic approach to negotiations. In interviews late in his career, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he spoke candidly about his experiences in New York in the 1950s and 1960s. He described the Coca-Cola incident, laughing at his own initial prejudice and the certainty with which he and his colleagues had dismissed American products without ever having tried them. "We thought we knew everything," he reflected in a 1995 interview. "We had our theory, our analysis, our ideological framework that explained everything. But theory is not reality. Analysis is not experience. I learned more about America from drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola than from reading 100 propaganda briefings. Not because the Coca-Cola was particularly important in itself, but because it forced me to question whether my other assumptions might also be wrong. Once you begin questioning, once you allow doubt to enter, you can never return to that state of absolute certainty. And perhaps that is a good thing. Perhaps certainty is the enemy of understanding." This insight speaks to a broader truth about the Cold War and its eventual resolution. The conflict ended not because one side militarily defeated the other, but because the Soviet system gradually lost the ideological confidence that had sustained it. Soviet citizens, including Soviet leaders, came to recognize that their system was not delivering on its promises, that the standard of living in the West was genuinely superior, that the communist future they had been promised was receding rather than approaching. This recognition was the result of countless small encounters, countless moments like Yuri Dubinin's first sip of Coca-Cola, when reality challenged ideology and reality won. Epilogue. The bottle sits empty now, a museum piece in a collection of Cold War artifacts. Its glass has yellowed slightly with age, the label faded but still legible. Visitors pass by it without much notice, drawn instead to more dramatic exhibits: missiles, spy equipment, pieces of the Berlin Wall. But that bottle contains within it a story as significant as any military confrontation, a small moment of human connection that helped bridge the chasm between two hostile worlds. The laughter of Soviet diplomats, their certainty that they knew what Coca-Cola represented without ever having tasted it, reflects a larger truth about ideology and its limitations. We construct elaborate theoretical frameworks to explain the world, to categorize experience, to distinguish friend from enemy, good from evil. These frameworks give us comfort and certainty, but they also blind us to reality when reality refuses to conform to our expectations. The willingness to taste, to experience, to allow our preconceptions to be challenged, this is the beginning of wisdom. Yuri Dubinin's transformation from ideological certainty to nuanced understanding was not a betrayal of his principles, but a deepening of his humanity. He remained a Soviet diplomat, continued to serve his country, never abandoned his belief that societies should strive for greater equality and justice. But he learned to recognize that different systems might have different strengths, that the world was more complex than any single ideology could capture, that understanding required humility and openness to experience. The Coca-Cola bottle became his teacher in a way that no propaganda briefing ever could. It taught him that pleasure is not necessarily exploitation, that efficiency can serve human needs, that capitalism might produce some things of genuine value even if the system as a whole had serious flaws. These were not comfortable lessons for a Soviet diplomat to learn, but they were necessary ones. They made him more effective in his role, better able to negotiate with Americans because he understood them more fully, more capable of finding common ground because he recognized their common humanity. The Cold War was ultimately about competing visions of how human beings should organize their collective life. Should we prioritize equality or freedom, security or opportunity, collective purpose or individual fulfillment? These were and remain genuine questions, not easily answered, requiring wisdom and humility from all sides. The tragedy of the Cold War was that it reduced these complex questions to simple binaries, that it demanded absolute loyalty to one side or the other, that it made curiosity seem like treason and doubt like weakness. The diplomats who laughed at Coca-Cola before they tried it were not fools or villains. They were products of their system, shaped by their education and experience, doing their best to serve their country and their ideals. Their laughter reflected genuine beliefs about capitalism and its products, but their willingness to actually taste the beverage, to allow their experience to challenge their assumptions, revealed something more fundamental about human nature, our capacity for growth, for learning, for changing our minds when confronted with new evidence. This capacity is what ultimately made peaceful coexistence possible. As more Soviet officials had direct experience of Western society, as more Americans encountered Soviet citizens as individuals rather than ideological abstractions, the demonizing narratives on both sides became harder to maintain. People discovered that their supposed enemies were human beings much like themselves, flawed, complex, capable of both cruelty and kindness, trying to build decent lives within the constraints of their respective systems. The Coca-Cola bottle, in its humble way, facilitated this discovery. It was a small thing, a moment of refreshment on a warm September afternoon, but it opened a door in Yuri Dubinin's mind that could never quite be closed again. Through that door came doubt, questions, curiosity, and eventually a more mature understanding of the world and his place in it. This was not the transformation that Soviet authorities hoped to cultivate in their diplomats, but it was the transformation that contact with reality inevitably produced. We live now in a world where the Cold War has passed into history, where Soviet diplomats and American adversaries have given way to new conflicts and new certainties. But the lesson of that Coca-Cola bottle remains relevant. We are all, in our own ways, like those Soviet diplomats, convinced that we understand things we have never directly experienced, certain that our ideological frameworks capture the whole truth, dismissive of alternatives we have never seriously considered. The willingness to taste, to experience, to allow our certainties to be challenged, this remains as difficult and as necessary as ever. The bottle sits in its museum case, a monument to a small moment of transformation, a reminder that the path to understanding begins with the courage to question what we think we know. It tells us that bridges between hostile worlds are built not through grand diplomatic gestures, but through countless small acts of curiosity and openness. It teaches us that ideology, however sophisticated, can never fully capture the complexity of human experience. And it whispers to us across the decades that the most revolutionary act is sometimes simply to taste what we have been taught to reject, to experience what we have been told to fear, to allow reality to speak for itself rather than filtering it through the lens of our preconceptions. The Soviet diplomats who laughed at Coca-Cola and then tried it anyway were, in their small way, heroes of intellectual honesty. They allowed their experience to challenge their beliefs. They chose curiosity over certainty. They took the first step on a journey that would eventually help end the Cold War, not through military victory, but through the gradual recognition that the world was more complex, more interconnected, and more human than ideology had allowed them to see. The bottle remains, a testament to that journey, a symbol of the power of small moments to change minds and, eventually, to change history.